In any conversation about World of Warcraft and the inevitable pseudo-debate between retail and classic and the also inevitable classic is so easy trope, I always bring up threat as a counterpoint. No, I don't think classic threat as a mechanic makes the game hard per se, in comparison to the compounding fight mechanics and more complicated rotations of retail. And I know that threat as a mechanic still exists in retail, but as far as I know it's only a real concern with the skittish Mythic Plus key. I'm not exactly a role player when it comes to WoW, but for me, threat as a proper overarching mechanic to the game increases my immersion, a word that will come up in likely all of my future gaming videos. Something about establishing threat and establishing the tank as the most threatening target for the boss just makes sense to me. There needs to be a reason for him to be able to get a big dragon to chase him around and position him for the DPS to properly deal damage. For me, it makes sense for that reason to be identifiable as an ironclad leader with imposing presence, brandishing the legendary weapon and leading the charge and doing the most damage, or at least appearing to be doing the most damage, hence threat. The part that pushes my buttons the right way is that at some point the other dual-wielding warriors or the fire mage in the corner have gone unchecked for far too long, and the mob diverts their attention elsewhere, which is where the saucy taunt comes into play.
Matt Hardy crashed and burned.
And look at Randy Orton slithering.
Oh, watch out, watch out, watch out, watch out!
KO! Here's the cover. Hook of the line. And the legend killer picks up the victory.
I hit execute, and I hit execute really well. Warrior was my first 60, but was shelved during phase 2. Later, I threw him in a guild that fit my schedule and started DPSing in late phase 3. That being said, I was relatively undergeared at the start of my warrior DPS career. The guild I joined was melee stacked, and I was just another one of the rampaging, dual-wielding lunatics. It was a small guild, one raid team with no subs. They had multiple rank 14s and a Thunderfury Maladath main tank. To everyone's surprise, I quickly began topping the meters despite using a Kelsterar main hand. With a big factor of warrior overall DPS coming from the execute phase, me being a null factor for much of the fight, threat-wise, gave me a considerable measure of leeway to mash execute brainlessly. A few world buff juiced crits later, and I was at the top of the boss damage meter. Despite wanting to jump straight to CTS, the Loot Council mandated that I was to receive a Viscag, which I did. With relative salt, I came into the following week's raid night, and proceeded to wipe the raid during Velstraz. The increase in overall DPS from the sword upgrade destroyed that big gap of threat I usually had. Because that leeway wasn't there for me to mash execute, I surmounted the tank's threat. I was complacent in my position on my threat table and was no longer monitoring aggro as I should have. Throughout the phases of classic WoW, Hunters started off as king of the damage meters, but as gear progressed, Hunters mostly stayed stagnant. In my opinion, this is likely to have a lot to do with how hit chance is mostly non-applicable to ranged attacks. Melee naturally scaling harder with weapons, the casters getting their steroids, and some buffs not applying to ranged physical. In the beginning, opening with the Hunter combo meant no chance of tanks establishing aggro properly. Marksman Hunters have pretty on-demand burst. Auto aim shot, auto multi-shot. Doesn't really need to crit. It'll slap no matter what. Doing this as an opener was very annoying for tanks. You have Feign Death of course, but it's a pretty buggy move, and when working correctly, you still have about a 1 in 5 chance in failure against raid mobs. If everything goes right, you still get an awkward ping pong that's unfavorable to the whole raid team, especially with directional mob abilities. It's simply bad Huntard practice to rely on Feign Death. That being said, I had a lot of playtime with Rockdalar. My openers became 2 auto shot leeway and aim shot with no multi-shot because that ability, as everybody knows, has plenty of its own complications in group play. As months passed and tanks got stronger, I was pretty much able to open however I wanted, and tanks would hold. Eventually I got my long-deserved Ashrathul, and the Huntard memes began rolling in again.
Please. Pally power, res Pepe smoke right away, everyone else run to the room. CTS! Oh.
Crossbow!
Breathe in and out, and let the crossbow do the work. 2, 1!
I was hitting hard. On paper, it doesn't seem like much of an upgrade. Almost a downgrade even. I was skeptic at first because I was still managing 99 parses without the crossbow, but boy was I wrong. The fat crits put me back on the map of the mobs, and all of a sudden I was a threat again, and demanding the attention of mobs if I didn't chill, and had to rely on that feign death button once more. One thing that I really enjoy about Threat is it was ever present in the leveling experience. If you're questing in a duo, you passively understood the mechanics of Threat and how to handle aggro. How to back off if you didn't want it, when to pump the brakes, or even how to juggle it. You were pretty quick to realize during early 5-man dungeons how to work synergistically, unless you're one of those types that just yells at the tank for bad aggro. This understanding ultimately transferred into raiding. Let the tank do their job and you do yours. Just not too well, otherwise you'll gain more attention over the tank. Of course, the part about flaming the tank is also still a little true. In my opinion, it's this tank DPS relationship that makes classic raiding feel satisfyingly involved. Community was always this game's strongest aspect, and the unspoken conversation is felt by players. When you're pushing DPS, you can feel your tank's threat generation. When you're tanking, you can feel the DPS challenging your aggro. You can feel a heal style of your healers, and with 5-man content, healing rips aggro off you all the time. That unspoken conversation becomes a real conversation in terms of threat generation versus damage mitigation on your tanks. It sucks that the tanks get all the gear for a while, but trusting them and them being stronger is in fact making the team much stronger. Increased threat on the tank allows the DPS to pump harder and heals to consume less. What's needed or helpful throughout particular fights: tank sacrificing damage mitigation for threat mitigation, a slight delay in DPS starting rotation, or heals pre-queued for particular fight mechanics, etc. Alright, do I use a shield and a mighty rage potion, or dual wield with the stone shield potion?
Dual wield.
Oh, okay.
Is that your res pokey?
I don't need one for my off.
Josh says dual wield as well. Big dick time.
Big swords.
Hey man, you gotta join us.
PX will be on Skull, Catsburg will be on X. Cereal Boy, you're going to tank Moon and Square. Make sure you put on a shield and a high damage mid gear.
This guy just... I was just told by raid leaders to use a shield.
Diamond. We have Orlu. I'm sorry. Cheldo is on. Every fight mechanic still obeyed threat as a primary principle of the game, which makes classic endgame what it is for me. This spirals into the weird politic of loot council, which again made community the most important aspect of classic WoW. While it's a bit dangerous leaving player power and progression in the hands of the player or other players, that just continuously played into the scope of community's importance. What do you think about threat? What item upgrades did you feel the most? Any particular fights give your team problems? Leave a comment, like, and subscribe, and until next time, take care.